So I will leave a couple of minutes so our presenters can introduce themselves and their organizations. Amanda, Thomas?
Thank you, Paula, and thank you to InspiraFarms for organizing this. The Global Cold Chain Alliance is the trade association for refrigerated warehousing, refrigerated transportation, and the construction of temperature-controlled facilities. We have 1,300 member companies in about 80 countries, and we have representative offices in Brazil, Europe, India, Latin America, and South Africa. What is unique about GCCA, what separates us from other trade associations, is that we also do international development work, usually through donor-funded projects. Much of this work is targeted to training and education on the cold chain, which makes me especially grateful to InspiraFarms for taking the initiative to organize this session. In my role at GCCA as Senior Director of International Projects, I oversee and manage these activities, but we use our members as our technical experts. This means that we approach cold chain development from a business perspective, and this is a perspective that I will endeavor to present today on the webinar. Thanks again, Paula.
Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Paula. So I'm Thomas Mottmans from the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, BASE, a Swiss not-for-profit organization and specialized partner of United Nations Environment, founded in 2001. We design, develop, and implement innovative business models, financing structures, and risk mitigation mechanisms to incentivize investments in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and more generally, climate change solutions. So this is us in short. We work mostly in really trying to close this gap between the finance gap needed for these projects and mobilizing mostly local and private resources. And now I'm within BASE, I am managing the Cooling as a Service initiative, about which we can talk later.
Thank you, Thomas. And as many of you know, InspiraFarms is an agricultural technology company that produces energy efficient cooling and food processing solutions for the first mile of distribution in agricultural supply chains. So we can start with the agenda. Second. So I will leave the space to Rodney to give us like an introductory presentation about cooling as a service.
Thank you, Paula. And good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone from wherever you're from. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Rodney Muriuki. And I work in project design and business development for InspiraFarms. And I have a bias in post-harvest technology and processing. And for the next couple of minutes, what I'll be taking us through is to try and paint a scenario and tell you more about our learnings on cooling as a service in agricultural supply chains in sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit of Latin America over the past year or two. Now, a shocking statistic is that only 3% of the total output of agricultural produce from Africa is refrigerated in the first mile. What do I mean by the first mile? The first mile is from the point that the product is harvested to its first point of cooling, or the first point of value addition. In 2018, supply from Africa had a sale value of $118 billion US. This was equivalent to about 500 million tons of fresh produce and was sold at an average price of $241, compared to a world average of $438 US. This is actually almost a half of the same type of, at the same price of the same type of produce, and a $70 billion US worth of value missed. Just to put it into perspective, if peas are coming in from Rwanda or Kenya, or the same are coming from a country like Guatemala or Mexico, that means the supplier from Mexico will get us twice as much for that same value of produce. In post-harvest, we say that the state at which the produce is, immediately it's harvested, it's the best it's ever going to be. And it's always a race against time to maintain that state. Now, from the 2018 figures, this builds a case for operators to introduce cold chain at every point of the value chain, right from the farm level to the retail, and then finally to the consumer. The importance of cooling as a service in agricultural supply chains is to enhance accessibility of cooling technology by running an OpEx-based model. So this means that farmers, producers can pay per month or per kilo, or on a rate agreed upon by the cooling service provider to reduce losses, equally increase efficiency and revenues within the value chain. So first mile cooling increases the sellable volume of produce over the harvested volume. And that means that the cost of production per unit of sold product goes down as a result, meaning more money for the farmer, more money for the producer, and more money for the off-taker. Now, most refrigeration solutions in emerging markets are brought about by vertically integrated companies or large exporters, as opposed to third-party logistic companies. And there could be a myriad of reasons as to why this could be the case. One, the amount of capital required to put up such facilities, and also the readiness of the market if it's not mature enough. But the interesting thing is that of the exported produce from African countries, smallholders and outgrowers contribute up to 70% of the fresh produce exported. So why is it difficult for these producers to access cooling technology at the first mile? Well, we all know farming is a risky business. So there's limitations to access to finance to invest in such technology, and also because of the scale they operate in. Most farmers, smallholder farmers and outgrowers have a small plot of about 250 square meters, and their operating cash flows or their decisions cannot allow them to access such technology. There's the integration of the supply chain as well, transport limitations, and to ensure that transport and processing activities are planned for seamlessly, it helps further to manage these costs. And seeing that farming activities are always in the remote areas of a production land or country, there's always challenge, especially in emerging markets, with access to energy. So they cannot be able to power these facilities to bring about value with cooling. So we need to bring refrigeration to the first mile. And while the developed supply chain currently is concentrated on service provided in the last mile, like in the fast food chain, your KFCs, your McDonald's, your Subways, and also retail, value is actually brought in the first mile to maintain quality and increase shelf life. The peas you see in the screen are for a client in Europe with their origin in Zimbabwe. And Heather, my colleague, will be speaking more about those. But as you see them, I wouldn't eat them. And as you can tell, they were definitely counted as rejects for disposal. If you know the industry well enough, then you understand that this loss in most cases would be transferred to the supplier or even to the farmer from its source. So in the post-harvest value chain, time equals shelf life equals money. For every hour from picking to cooling, there is impact on the number of days of shelf life. For example, for those snow peas or manchtut, for every 4 hours from picking to cold chain that is lost, it is equal to 1 day of shelf life. For more sensitive produce like berries, every hour could be 1 day to 1.5 days of shelf life. But then again, to the shocking statistic, only 3% is refrigerated in the first mile. 15 million tons equals to 3% of the 500 million tons that Africa sold in 2018. So that means 485 million tons is not refrigerated at source. So what comes next? The opportunity that lies. By developing a network of first mile cooling solutions and maintaining the cold chain regime after, we can help reduce losses while increasing the sellable volume. The photo on display, as you can see there, shows produce after harvest at a temperature of 43 degrees centigrade, while it should be between 2 to 5 degrees. So it's definitely not obeyed the 1 to 4 hour rule. And that means produce losses. $50 billion US is the potential of just including cold chain in the first mile. And I will concentrate on the first mile because, as I said before, all these other aspects post-processing of the value chain are mostly concentrated and developed. $50 billion. This is the biggest opportunity that's presented in this phase. And with the least amount of investment, especially with cooling as a service, the greatest returns can be gotten even without investing in new crop trials or diversifying into new products as we see off-takers doing. So the key is to develop cooling solutions that can serve narrow windows for seasonal crops or year-round production, embracing mobility and the sustainability of technology. So how do we bring about this opportunity? To allow us to respond to growing global demand from areas with challenges to energy access or weak infrastructure, I call it the triangle: technology, pricing, and scale. For technology, with pre-cooling, you need up to 10 times more the energy that is used to maintain temperature, and we need to get it right. Efficient performance means saved energy costs, more dollars in the pocket, and minimum product loss. If we get the technology right, then we'll definitely get the pricing right. With the right technology, there's a great chance that we will get the pricing right, hence making it accessible to more farmers and producers. And if we get the technology and the pricing right, then we hit the sweet spot. It then makes business sense to provide cooling as a service at scale. So putting different hubs at different levels of the value chain, including the first mile, then increases the value and maintains the product of the commodity. And the value it provides is shelf life. For example, in the green beans value chain, if this is not maintained due to if the cold chain regime is not maintained due to lack of cold storage, losses are between 15 to 20%. And this means that for every kilo of produce harvested, up to 200 grams is lost due to lack of first mile cooling. And for the same green bean value chain, this means that, for example, this season between July to September, as Europe is in its summer period, while a farmer would have fetched about $1.50 for every kilo, they lose 28 cents due to such losses that could be reduced by introduction to cold chain at the right time. Therefore, for 1 ton of produce, they could lose up to $280 US. So in my experience, for example, in the East African region, Rwanda provides these services, but they're expensive. During this pre and post and during the COVID period, prices have ranged between 47 and 52 Rwandese francs per kilo per day. But this cooling as a service is only provided towards the end of the value chain, so just before it's exported. And while there's value within the whole value chain, the most value through cooling as a service can be unlocked by making it accessible at the first mile. So why do we need to introduce cooling as a pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-chill model in this industry? They can be able to access this technology without necessarily committing significant capital in these assets. Then we go to the solution. While the first mile is important, as I've said, then we should not neglect the rest of the cold chain. Once the produce is cooled down on pre-cooling or first mile cooling, the temperature is then maintained throughout the cold chain regime. It is, however, good to note that there's a difference between pre-cooling and temperature maintenance. And most of the solutions, as Amanda and a few of my colleagues will tell you, are designed for temperature maintenance. So cooling down produce needs up to 10 times the energy as opposed to maintaining produce temperature. And hence, the importance of allowing farmers or producers from the first mile, while not investing in CapEx, to access cooling technology. So what does working on OpEx mean? 3 things: affordability, sustainability, and efficiency. Affordability and accessibility, because no CapEx is required from the users. Sustainability, because cold chain has the potential to increase the sellable output per kilo without necessarily increasing the cost of input. So for a farmer, it means by just introducing the cold chain, no extra fertilizer, no extra inputs like seeds or labor, just introducing the cold chain at the first mile. Sustainability and efficiency, because it is maximizing the input of the investment into the value chain by reducing losses and coordinated logistics chains. So for off-takers, they can coordinate their transport. Instead of picking per day, they can pick every 2 days because their product is maintained in a chilled and cooled fashion. So as a result, cooling technology then moves from a balance sheet decision to a cash flow decision, unlocking tremendous potential in the value chain. Cooling as a service for agricultural supply chain, I would say, would be the future, especially in emerging markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie, for a great introductory presentation. So I will be back to the agenda. 1 second, I switch to the deck. So our first question is for Amanda. What is the Global Cold Chain Alliance and its members doing in African agricultural supply chains? And how does cooling as a service respond to some of the challenges faced by large-scale cold chain providers in the industry?
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining this webinar. So what is GCCA doing? Africa is the area where we have the fewest members, which also means that it represents the area with the highest potential for growth. GCCA recognizes this and has established our newest office in South Africa. It opened in 2019. Most GCCA members are third-party logistics providers, or 3PLs. They are specialists in the logistics of temperature-controlled products. Rodney mentioned earlier the vertical integration that's common where cold chain is first developing. This means that a retailer or a processor builds their own warehouse and purchases their own refrigerated trucks to guarantee control over the supply chain and ensure food safety. Over time, where opportunities exist, 3PLs emerge, offering sophisticated or specialized services so that the retailers or food processors do not need to invest in the capital required to build their own facility, nor in the very specific technical knowledge required to run those facilities. They can outsource that aspect of their business and focus on their core competency. In Africa, we are starting to see a shift emerging with greater interest in the feasibility of 3PLs, and eventually this will take off. That said, there are 3 basic premises we've learned in our experience at GCCA about cold chain development that I would like for you to consider. First, it is a chain. It begins once the product has been harvested with post-harvest practices and that critical but often overlooked step of removing field heat. It includes the transportation required to get the product off the farm, perhaps to further processing and onward into storage, and then secondary distribution, and finally to retail where it can be sold for consumption. Too often, cold chains equated only with storage, with little emphasis on the other critical links. This is important because if you take a product that has already been temperature abused, using refrigeration will mitigate further deterioration, but it will not fix the product. Also, if field heat is not removed through pre-cooling before putting the product directly into a refrigerated truck or cold storage, it taxes the equipment, as Rodney mentioned, which is designed to maintain temperatures, not to remove the field heat. Because it is a chain, what occurs at each link is critical for the next step. Second, it is costly, and this can be thought of in a couple of ways. As Rodney mentioned, building a warehouse requires a lot of capital. These are multi-million-dollar investments that require substantial time and technical expertise. Lead time is typically 2 to 4 years. Also, for the size of a typical 3PL, the operating expenses are significant, with the main cost being energy and labor. Considering how expensive it is, it makes sense that the first 3PLs to emerge are typically centered around export markets, as these are the consumers with the highest willingness and ability to pay for temperature-controlled products. Local markets, especially in rural areas, often lack the ability to pay for product that has received temperature control. So when I say cold chain is expensive, it's not only the investment in the physical asset, but the cost that gets passed on to the consumers. Finally, cold chain is complicated. It is not rocket science, as one of my colleagues likes to say, but it does require specific knowledge about commodity storage, handling, packing, and packaging, refrigeration maintenance, and operational practices within a warehouse, just to name a few. Traditional cold storage also relies extensively on infrastructure, especially roads, water, and electricity. Appropriate business models are often neglected or misunderstood, as is the need to provide training on foundational best practices. I often see cold chain cited as a recommendation to address food loss, and I'm always grateful to see it acknowledged, but I think sometimes that seeing it as a one-line recommendation gives the impression that it's a simple fix, when actually there are quite a lot of moving parts. So how can cooling as a service be used to address these issues? In my opinion, this is an opportunity to apply the basic premise of a 3PL, but use it to serve areas that otherwise do not have access to refrigeration. It is a method of rethinking the application of temperature-controlled logistics that reduces the cost of building or installation, and in some cases, depending on the equipment, to provide services in areas that are off-grid. There is great potential to scale within a relatively short period of time. There's been a lot of interest in recent years on developing new technologies and innovations to solve issues with food loss. while I don't want to say that there is no value in this type of creativity, what really excites me with cooling as a service is that this is a new application of a proven model. And with that, I think we can transition over to Thomas so we can hear more about the benefits. Thank you again for listening and for attending this webinar.
Thank you, Amanda. So next questions for Thomas. What are the benefits of cooling as a service? And how does it make energy use and cooling agricultural supply chains more sustainable? And how is BASE supporting the adoption of the model?
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Amanda and Rodney, for setting the scene so well. Hi, everyone. So over the past 3 years at BASE, we have been increasingly focusing on efficient cooling through different partnerships with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, CEST, which is a philanthropy under Climate Works based in California. So we launched in 2018 the Cooling as a Service initiative, which aims to increase the adoption of more efficient cooling systems with the use of that new business model, cooling as a service. So cold chain logistics, especially those dealing with fresh produce, is quite a complex topic. And Amanda and Rodney have discussed about the importance of making refrigeration accessible for the first mile of such distribution network. So really this from the production to the actual logistics service point. And achieving this goal without having a significant impact on the environment requires not only technical, but also innovative financial solutions. For most cooling technologies, the main component contributing to the life cycle cost of the equipment are actually electricity consumption and maintenance. The initial investment is only a small fraction. So in other words, the total cost of ownership of the cooling systems is most effectively reduced by installing the most efficient systems and by optimizing the preventive maintenance offered to subsystems, and also by applying system thinking, for example, by adding components like thermal storage or passive cooling, which enable to reduce the load. However, we still see that many market barriers, some of which were already mentioned, and misaligned incentives result in the fact that cooling users tend to invest in those technologies that might require a lower upfront investment, but result in higher operating costs, or do not invest in cooling at all, which results in this case in wasted food or in wasted food or reduced food quality. And I'd like to highlight a couple here. We mentioned already through Amanda and Rodney that customers are normally sensitive to purchase price. So even though cost savings from higher efficiency and higher build quality resulting in less maintenance or less breakdowns will ultimately make up for the additional cost, this is not something that customers necessarily see. Secondly, and this is an important one too, that customers often, or cooling users typically would lack trust in the performance of these new technologies. So the question then comes whether the promised energy savings or food savings actually are worth the additional investment in a better technology. Third, cooling users tend to prefer in their core business. And for although cooling is crucial for producers, it's actually not part of the core business. It's just a necessary component. And finally, spare parts and adequate maintenance is often either not available or overlooked. And cooling users normally don't have the required expertise themselves. So in traditional business models in which basically the equipment is sold, the solution provider does not have necessarily the incentive to offer this optimal maintenance. And that's when we come to servitization, which really means moving from selling products to selling services, or moving from a transaction model to a subscription model. And this aims at really overcoming these barriers. For cooling, we call this cooling as a service. And as already was presented, it really means having users paying per kilogram of produce cooled instead of actually investing in the asset that delivers the cooling. And the provider is then the one owning the asset, maintaining the asset, and operating the asset. In itself, product as a service models, as Amanda mentioned, is not something new. It's a proven model, and it's actually growing rapidly across industries. So to name only a few, we can think of Xerox, who sells copies rather than copy machines. Rolls-Royce selling power by the hour rather than selling the engines for airplanes. Or Signify offering hours of lighting to the airport of Amsterdam Schiphol instead of selling the actual fixtures and the lamps. In the solar sector as well, power purchase agreements have really been the model enabling the rapid growth and uptake of this new technology, because customers were able to purchase kilowatt hours of produced solar energy instead of having to actually invest in the solar panels. So this essentially eliminated the performance risk that was perceived by these customers. And now with the cooling sector, we see that we're really at the brink of this revolution, shifting towards a service model for the cooling industry. It's interesting to have a look at the pricing mechanism. So let's imagine a producer. So the value that producers, or crop producers understand best, or farmers, is the value of the crop they actually produce. And this is typically defined in US dollar per kilogram or US dollar per ton. So this means that users will be able to best estimate the added value of the cooling service if it is offered with a similar pricing mechanism. So if I as a farmer know that I can earn 20 cents more on my kilogram of tomatoes if it's cooled properly, then I'm definitely willing to pay a couple of cents to cool that kilogram. So this is one of the benefits of the pay-per-use model, that the pricing it's easy to relate to the price for the users. So the cooling as a service model can really make agricultural supply chains more sustainable, in that it positions the provider as the decision maker on the technology used to deliver the cooling. And this will be decision based on a long-term vision rather than on a short-term upfront investment considerations. The provider then also has the incentive to offer this optimal preventive maintenance to maximize operating efficiency, to reduce unplanned breakdowns and downtime, and to avoid more expensive corrective maintenance in the future. And also the model incentivizes the design of cooling solutions for long-term use, for instance, through modular designs. So how we are supporting the adoption of the model with CEST, we are leading this cooling as a service initiative to stimulate the market to adopt the model in various sectors, including in the agricultural cold chain. The initiative includes a couple of components. First, we have been developing tools to enable the model, such as cooling as a service contracts, pricing models, and financial structures to monetize the projects. And these will be actually available next month on our website, which is Caas-initiative.org, so Caas-initiative.org. Second, we are working with technology providers and investment funds to test the model in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So we work on projects from various sectors, ranging from commercial and industrial air conditioning and retail refrigeration to small-scale cold storage for vaccine and agricultural cold chains. And within the agricultural cold chain, we're currently working in Kenya with InspiraFarms, in Nigeria with Coolbox, and in India with Coolcrop. So InspiraFarms and Coolcrop focus on pre-cooling and cold rooms, while Coolbox develops off-grid freezers for fresh produce traders at street markets in Lagos to reduce food waste. So first the tools, second these pilot projects, and thirdly we have created partnerships with different actors to establish what we call the Cooling as a Service Alliance, which today includes almost 40 organizations, including cooling technology providers, including investors and different networks like the World Green Building Council. And the aim is really to reach a consensus on the definition of cooling as a service and to encourage the implementation of the model. And finally, one of our goals is really also to spread the word about the model and to build capacity, so to share the knowledge we've built through different workshops, different webinars, publications, collaborations. And for instance, so we had a first matchmaking events, bringing together those different stakeholders that can implement the model. And now we're planning a global e-summit, Cooling as a Service e-summit on the 1st of December, which will look into the technical aspects that I mentioned before, so the pricing model and the contracts, and which will showcase projects where this has been implemented. And this will also include, of course, projects in the agricultural cold chain sector. So to conclude, I would like to say that we see a big potential really for cooling as a service to reduce food waste and to increase the quality and value of food for small and medium scale producers. And particularly with rising temperatures and COVID adding additional strain on the food supply chains, this is a solution we believe more companies should adopt. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. So let's move to the third question for Heather. What experience has InspiraFarm had on doing cooling as a service, and how it is expected to scale up in East and Southern Africa?
Thanks, Paula, and hi to all the participants. Thanks for joining us today. So I'd like to just start with a couple of points before I dive into some of the case studies, and it really just builds on what's already been said. First of all, that cooling as a service, to put it really simply, is just the separation of the ownership of the asset and the user or the product owner. And then what's also really critical in understanding what the cold chain is it's a supply chain where every point and every link along the supply chain has to be refrigerated and cooled. And then looking into that one step further is you really need to understand at each step, is this a temperature drop or is this temperature maintenance? Because that's quite significant in understanding the type of infrastructure that you're going to be investing in or the service that you're going to be offering. So going from there, I'd like to go through a couple of case studies, starting with Southern Africa with my peas that Rodney had mentioned earlier on his slide. So starting in Zimbabwe, where those peas originated from, we found that in 2017, there was a huge increase on the demand to use ocean freight as opposed to air freight. And Zimbabwe's a landlocked country. So this means the transit period went from 72 hours to 28 to 35 days, in which case any inefficiencies along the cold chain are really emphasized. And what this means is for every hectare of production, 10,000 kgs should be A-grade quality product, which means that it's fit for retail market at final destination. And because of the inefficiencies in the cold chain, 15% of that was lost during the post-harvest period, which is 1,500 kgs a hectare or $3,000 per hectare for the farmer, which is quite a significant loss. So we came together as an industry and we really analyzed the supply chain as a whole using temperature loggers to identify where were the peaks in temperature and what could we do to address the issues. And also understanding at what point were people able to invest in the right infrastructure. So what was quite critical here is land security isn't great, and the farmers were not comfortable in making multiple investments themselves. So the freight forwarders took on the investment, and by consolidating everyone's produce and doing the final temperature drop, so the farmers were removing field heat and then freight forwarders doing final temperature drop for the ocean freight, they were able to offer the service across a wide range of growers, which meant that the average cost of cooling came down and it became quite a viable option along the supply chain. And that service was charged either to the grower or to the final market, whoever was able to absorb the cost. And within that season, we were able to bring the rejection rate down from 15% to 1% in 1 3-month season, which is quite a significant impact and a great success story. Staying in Zim, we also did some work with a stone fruit estate. So they produce peaches and nectarines and also some apples. And they've been considering investing into expanding their production for quite some time, but they had concerns with being able to market their product correctly. And what we found on this farm is they had cold rooms, but they did not have forced air coolers, which are critical, 1, in removing the field heat, and 2, in the final temperature drop. You literally have to force the cold air over the product and make sure that all the product is receiving the same treatment, and the boxes right in the middle of the pallets are just as cold as the ones on the outside. And as the estate manager explained to me, he felt like he was trying to bake bread without an oven. So they invested in the right technology, and the impact was that they reduced the softening of their fruit and reduced the development of disease. And they were able to successfully market their products to export markets, again using ocean freight, with enough shelf life on arrival to make it a viable option for the buyers. And it's given them confidence to expand their marketing network, and they're actually going to be expanding their production areas now as well. And taking you quickly across the border into Mozambique, we spent some time with a lychee farmer. that had very, very basic cooling infrastructure, which was fine in the first couple of seasons of export because the volumes were significantly lower. And what he found is in 2018, the number of trees that had matured had increased, and also the yields on the already mature trees had doubled. And the infrastructure he had was not good enough to be able to cool the product at those volumes. And within 72 hours of picking and packing, there was mold development on the fruit. And in this particular case, 50% of the crop was lost because it was no longer fit for human consumption, which, you know, even at a local market level, it wasn't acceptable. And some urgent action had to be taken. So we helped the grower to come up with a design that's actually modular. So it wasn't expensive in the outset of the investment, and it can be expanded as production and as yields increase. And he had a really successful season last year where 100% of his crop was marketed and accepted in the final destination. And what's really exciting here is he is now marketing his facility to other growers in the area based on his proven success. We've also done some market research in Zambia. And Zambia is really interesting because there's a large number of startup projects. And again, with most emerging markets and most African countries, access to capital is really, really restricted. So these farmers are torn between investing in production and investing in the right infrastructure. So do they ring fence a certain amount and delay their expansion, or can they access cooling as a service, in which case all that capital can go into production and it can really jumpstart their projects for them. So there's a huge amount of opportunity and potential there. And then coming right across to Kenya, to East Africa, again, this model and understanding the supply chain and where your intervention is going to come in is quite critical. So in Kenya, what we've seen is that access to land is restricted. And so commercial supply chains are relying more and more on small-scale growers to produce for them. And these small-scale growers are actually producing on an acre or a quarter of an acre plot. And they're grouped into farmer groups, which is anywhere between 35 to 200 farmers in an area. And then they come together and form a communal collection point. But again, that land is really restricted. It's really, really small. And in most cases, there's actually no access to power infrastructure either. So we've come up with a design that is a very small, mobile, purpose-built cooling unit. It can be picked up and moved from farmer group to farmer group if needed. It can be moved from one production area to another production area if you need to follow seasons. And even at a commercial level, these units can be moved to follow your lands of production. So it's really bringing first mile as close to the crop as possible. And two of these sites that we're going to be trialing in the next couple of months are going to be 100% off-grid, and they will be solar powered. So that's really exciting to see as well. And we've had another really great success story in Mexico, working with tomato growers for Frubana. They were producing in an area that was 200 kilometers away from the first facility that could offer cooling and packing. And so we introduced a facility that was as close to the producers as possible. This meant they cut out the 200-kilometer journey, and this saved them 10% in the logistics chain, which is really exciting because every dollar saved in logistics is a dollar in your bottom line that you're not relying on the final market to absorb. These growers weren't able to invest individually into the right infrastructure, again, because one investment for one grower with the throughput meant a high cost of cooling per kg. So by allowing a community to come together and put their product through, the average cost of cooling comes right down. And the feedback we've received is that they've received a revenue increase of between 10 and 15% on average, one, because of higher prices, because of the quality, and two, because of their logistics savings. So these are just a few examples of our own experiences that are on the ground. They're real, they're exciting, and I hope that helps everyone to really understand how cooling as a service and understanding the right technology can really make a difference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Heather. So moving on with the agenda, we are going to be open to questions and answers. And I have seen in the chat that we have received a lot of questions. So I will start just speaking. Let's see how we are in time. So we have around 15 minutes, 10 minutes. So I will pick around 4. Let's see how is the time. So one question, have you seen any successful cold chain business model that are able to connect smallholder farmers to off-takers, like large retailer supermarkets? If so, what factors have contributed to this success? So maybe Amanda or Thomas can help us with this question?
Sure, I can start. I'm sure Thomas will probably have some things to add. So yes, it is possible for this to happen. And it's, I think the first factor that's required is simply patience. Second, though, I think it's training. It's really important not to focus only on the technology, but it's also really those foundational best practices. So you have to work with the farmers and whoever's going to be utilizing the temperature control, whether it's a truck or whether it's the pre-cooling or whatever the product is, storage. You need to know how to operate that equipment. So you need to know the appropriate temperatures, relative humidities for the products that are going to be stored, what products that can be stored together. In areas where there's not a model of cooling as a service, or you're not utilizing 3PL, it really requires a vested interest by the retailer to make those investments, whether it's on the infrastructure or packaging. And I think finally, frequent communication kind of coinciding with that patience that's required. But similar to what Rodney said, he had the triangle. I would actually argue there needs to be, maybe it's more of a square, because I think the training side of it should never be overlooked. We've seen experiences where technology was introduced, a solar powered storage was introduced in a country with little training on what could be stored. And so there was no pre-cooling, and the farmers took hot product and they put it directly into the facility. And then they also packed it too high, so they didn't allow for proper airflow to cool the product. And so basically it just heated up, and the product wilted, and it was thought that cooling didn't work, but that wasn't the case. It was that it had been operated improperly. So that's my answer. Thomas, I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add.
I think that was very comprehensive. Just one last comment, just mentioning that cooling as a service, in that it shifts the model in which the user is not anymore the one owning the asset and operating the asset, but actually the expert is doing that. It also facilitates coordination between the different actors in the supply chain, because that expert probably can extend this service to whichever point is desirable for the actual farmer. So this can go cover the whole supply chain, and then the service would cover basically also the coordination with these different actors. So that's the flexibility of the model is quite interesting, because you can redefine what service means depending on what the customer needs.
Thank you, Amanda and Thomas. Then I will pick other questions. I have seen several around affordability for the farmers. So one question will be, what is the typical minimum size for facility to be profitable for an operator? And as for the small farmers, will probably not have the resources to pay for these cooling services. How can you entice them to use them? How will you be paying for the cooling as a service? Maybe somebody from InspiraFarms can reply to this question.
If you want, I can take that.
Thank you,
I think there's been several questions, and having seen all the Q&A, I'll try as well to respond. So we've been talking about sizes, we've been talking about type of crops, plenty of questions on affordability. I think that what InspiraFarms tries to deliver is, let's say, from a minimum of couple of tons per day of throughput to much larger facilities in the order of the kind of 100 pallets. when referring to the type of energy, let's say that we can go up to 80% on solar, and as the price of energy storage decreases, we can increase that. But a lot of, we have to admit as well that a lot of clients, or the grid availability in Africa is improving and increasing as well in terms of reach. So we range from fully on grid to off grid with hybrid systems, solar and diesel. And in terms of crops, I think that there's a broad range of them, and that goes back to the affordability. Of course, there's crops that have much higher value, that are, for which it's easier to design and deploy a business model that works on the per kilo basis, even at small sizes. So if we're thinking about high value peas, or we're talking about berries, maybe even less than a ton a day might be worth the service or the investment. If we're talking about other crops that have a much lower volume, it needs a certain level of aggregation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Maybe Ronnie, you can aggregate something?
Probably just to add on to what Michele has said, in the point of energy access, in some cases we find that some users are fully off-grid, and this is where we might find some larger off-takers needing to access these services, and they might require either a diesel and a solar-powered facility with little battery backup. But of course, the payback periods that come with off-grid cooling technology can be calculated within the period of use. But this is also dependent on each case, depending on the scale, as Michele said, up from 6 pallets up to 100 or 500 pallets, and the point at which it's introduced in the value chain. Thanks.
Paula, I can also just add for
Yes.
the question on what the typical minimum size, what that would be for farmers. And I think there is no easy answer to that. It really depends on the volumes that you're looking at, and also the value of those products. You can do extensive studies or small scale studies that assess the feasibility of it, but those are basically the factors that you need to be looking at. What are the products that you've got? What's the value of those? And then what volumes are you looking at? And that then would guide you to the appropriate size facility.
Maybe I'd also like to quickly complement regarding the affordability and whether farmers would be able to actually afford the cooling service. I'd like to refer back to what I mentioned before about the actual pricing strategy or pricing mechanism, in that in the end, cooling 1 kilogram or 1 ton of produce will generate value to the farmer that is relatively easy to quantify, right? So if I can sell this to this other market in a little bit further than my local market, maybe I can generate 20 cents more for my kilogram or 20 euro more for my ton. This means that as long as the cooling price is quite lower than this, which it should be, which it is, then it should be affordable, because in the end it's an additional income. So there's no actual real cost related, there's just purely benefit. And this is the advantage of this pricing mechanism, that you do not need to actually put aside money to purchase this and hope that the return will be worth that investment, but you really just pay for that unit of food that you cool down, and you know already in advance that you will earn more than what you pay to cool the produce. So that's really where the value comes from.
Thank you, Thomas. We have 9 minutes left. I think that we can take one question more. What has been the feedback of some of the customers from cooling as a service? Maybe we can take an example that you know, Thomas, or an example from any of InspiraFarms. What has been the feedback of clients?
Paula, I can come in here also building on the previous question. you know, the ultimate goal is to maintain quality of the produce. So in the example with the peas from Zimbabwe that I had shared earlier, for every hectare, they were losing 1,500 kgs of A-grade product, which was $3,000. The cost of cooling was significantly lower than that. And what it meant was you were saving 15% of your revenue earning kgs. And so the benefit was immediate. I mean, with the arrival of the first containers and we saw the success carry through the season, the feedback was extremely positive. You know, people were jumping to look into further investments. How can they expand on this? How can the inefficiencies be improved even further? Because it comes down to revenue back to the farmer. And as long as you're getting positive results and you're reducing your post-harvest losses, the feedback so far has been really great. The same in Mexico, where quality's been improved. So they're seeing a higher value return to the farm. And it's not necessarily, you know, about expanding your production. It's about maximizing your yields off the land area that you've got. So by saving 15% of waste, it's got a real impact back to the farm and back to the final market as well.
Thank you, Heather. If anyone has any comment, or we can just move to the last point, to the closure. Okay, so the closure. So I leave the room to Michele, who is going to give us a summary of the main conclusions of this webinar.
Thank you, Paula. Well, first of all, I have to say thanks to all the panelists and as well to all the participants. I think that we've gone above 200 participants, and I've been busy at times looking as well at questions, but there's been more than 100 written interventions as well while the presentations were going on. I think that, you know, trying as well to wrap up what I've heard and what we work on daily basis, I think that you know, the size of the opportunity for fresh produce in sub-Saharan Africa might be way bigger of the challenge, and so, you know, I want to bring as well you know, a very optimistic and positive view of what we're seeing. A lot of interest, a lot of investment going on, a lot of new trade channels that are being established. And I think that represents as well one of the other takeaways that at least I bring with me after the webinar, which is that to build cold chains that allow, you know, increasing that value that producers, exporters, that the supply chain can generate, an ecosystem of services is required, really, from the pre-cooling at farm to as well to the protocols of takers going to logistics, third-party logistics, larger terminals, and many more services. I do think as well that one aspect that is influencing the sector a lot over the last few months has been the disruption of both sea and air freight related to the COVID emergency, which I think has generated more and more discussion in the industry on the need, you know, for more storage capacity, both, I would say, for export, but as well for import and last mile. And climate change has for sure not been decreasing. I think that there's been a lot that has been mentioned on on the models and how they can generate value for the first mile. And I would like to summarize that for 3 points that are for me fundamental. That is, one is really affordability, which means as well access. So the ability of bringing cooling capacity as close as possible to the source without the need of capex investment for the users. Of course, there's the need of doing due diligence before deploying an asset and understanding if the operations in terms of volume, in terms of products or type of product are viable, but I think that is very important. The second one is efficiency. There's been a lot of questions and mention of prices, of volumes, but really the idea is that the operator, for example, in our case, InspiraFarms, when deploying with a cooling as a service, are the ones most interested in having the most efficient technology possible, because basically the operating expenses are on us, and sustainability as a third point, because reducing losses, generating more output in the value chain by the same input, same amount of harvested volume, and lowering as well greatly emissions. Let's not forget that we harvest carbon, but when there's a big pile of vegetables rotting, they generate methane. It's extremely important. And I think as well that being able to bring this type of services on at the first mile is something that is going to radically reshape the way that a lot of supply chains can capture value. In most developed markets, we're talking about, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 8,000 pallet capacity for an average kind of warehouse that offers these type of services. Bringing that down to the few tons, it's a very exciting. It's very exciting, and hopefully over the next few years we can expand that as well to the millions of smallholders, but around which there's as well the need of support from a broader ecosystem to make sure that as well the yields, the inputs, and other dimensions are tackled. And so I would just leave everyone with a big thank you, and as well with a serious excitement and optimism for the values that can be generated on fresh produce in Africa, and because it's something that we all need. The last point probably is looking a bit at demand. Millennials or China have gone way above the 30% of fresh produce in their diets, and that is going to bring a lot of additional demand for producers and exporters from sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Michele. So I want to thank our invited speakers for joining this webinar, and for all the participants. As Michele mentioned, we had almost 200 persons that were watching the webinar, so we are very excited. So thank you very much. I'm sharing here my email. So probably we didn't reply to all the questions that you have, but feel free to send an email to my email, and we will try to reply as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.